You've got the truth. Right here, right now. Hearing the Truth Radio is now on the air, ringing in the dispensational new year with Mike Warren and D.S. Ferris. The topic for this week's show is the little horn of Daniel 8, continuing with the system of the Antichrist. D.S. Ferris, welcome again to Hearing the Truth.
Well, Mike, it is good to be here again for this study. Every week, I feel, is a gradual build-up to a larger picture of the system of Antichrist.
So, D.S., for the last 2 weeks, we've discussed the little horn of Daniel 7 and have identified 10 identifying marks of the Antichrist. This week, we're going to discuss the little horn of Daniel 8, and I'm sure that we're going to see even more identifying marks.
Yes, we are. Now, it is important that the audience realize that the study of Daniel chapter 8 may also be a 2-week study because we tie in Daniel chapter 9 with Daniel chapter 8. By the time we are done with these 2 chapters, we will see with far more clarity who the true Antichrist is.
Sounds like a good plan.
Now, let's begin by reading portions of Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 verse 1 says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. 2. I saw in the vision, and as it so happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. 3. Then I lifted up my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. 4. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. 5. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. 6. Then he came to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. 7. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. 8. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now let's stop here for a moment and ask the question, who are these beasts between verses 3 and 8? The answer is found between verses 20 through 22, and they read as follows. Verse 20 says, "The ram which you saw having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia." 21 says, "And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king." 22, "As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power." These 3 powers are the same as the bear and the leopard of Daniel 7. If you notice, the ram has 2 horns, and one horn outgrew the other. This is similar to the bear being raised up on one side, depicting one side of the bear higher than the other side. In other words, the kingdoms of Media and Persia originally were 2 different kingdoms that united, but over time the Persians outgrew the Medians, and the kingdom of Persia became a single empire. And the goat, once the first horn was broken off, grew 4 horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. This symbol is similar to the leopard, which had 4 heads. In other words, according to history, after Alexander the Great died, his 4 generals, Ptolemy, Cassander, Seleucus, and Lysimachus, divided the empire 4 ways, and for a period of time, Greece was divided into 4 kingdoms.
This is interesting because it proves that the Bible prophecies repeat and enlarge. In other words, as we study these prophecies in Daniel and Revelation, we'll see a repetition of symbols, but the prophecies enlarged to include more detail and attributes.
Yes, Mike, the Bible is filled with fundamental laws that must be applied in order to get factual interpretations. If we don't follow these laws, we get incorrect interpretations. Now let us continue with verse 8 and continue through some of the other verses. Daniel 8 verse 8 says, "Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven." 9. And out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. 12. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. And he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will be the vision? How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled under foot? 14. And he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed.
Now, this chapter between verse 9 and 14 sound like the little horn of Daniel 7, except with the added features of odiousness. But I've heard different preachers argue that the little horn of Daniel 8 is Antiochus Epiphanes. And what do you think of that idea?
The position of Antiochus is not comic book fiction like the Beliar man, because this character really did exist and really created an abomination in the Jewish temple. In this situation with Antiochus, we view his connection with Daniel 8 as an incorrect interpretation rather than a speculative problem. For starters, I will explain 5 good reasons why Antiochus is not a good choice for Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 14, and this 5-fold argument is to be found in chapter 4 of my book. Now, the first argument deals with Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. Dispensationalists make the 2,300 days a literal period, meaning the 2,300 days is a period of almost 6.5 literal years. Does Antiochus Epiphanes' desecration of the Jewish temple match this time frame? The dispensationalist John F. Walvoord says, the period of 2,300 mornings and evenings should be considered as 2,300 days of 24 hours each. This was the period during which the temple was desecrated from 171 to 165 BC, and that comes from Major Bible Prophecies, page 154. Walvoord also applied the apocryphal books of the Maccabees to his interpretation. He states, secular history, especially in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, reveals that Antiochus was a determined foe of the Jewish religion and did what he could to stamp it out. And that comes from Major Bible Prophecies, page 154. Now, Walvoord obviously did not read Maccabees. And why is that the case? 1st Maccabees, chapter 1, verses 54 through 59, and 1st Maccabees, chapter 4, verses 52 through 54, demonstrate the length of time Antiochus desecrated the Jewish temple. Now, chapter 1, verse 54 says, on the 15th day of the month Chislev in the year 145, the king erected the horrible abomination upon the altar of holocausts, and in the surrounding cities of Judah they built again pagan altars. Now, chapter 4:52 tells us when these desecrations ended. Chapter 4:52 says, early in the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, that is the month of Chislev, in the year 148. Now, note this clearly. The 15th day in the month Chislev, in the 145th year, up to the 25th day in the month Chislev, in the 148th year, equals 3 years and 10 days. Antiochus Epiphanes ruled from 175 BC to 164 BC and desecrated the Jewish temple down at the end of his reign for 3 years and 10 days. What is the conclusion for this argument? No matter how hard dispensationalists try, they can never squeeze 6.5 years into 3 years and 10 days. I'm sorry, it just does not work.
It's almost hilarious. How in the world can anyone dream of squeezing 6 years into 3 years and 10 days?
It would be hilarious if the Antiochus doctrine was not destroying some of the most sublime prophecies in the Bible. But as you're going to see throughout this whole entire study, the Antiochus doctrine destroys some of the most fundamental prophecies in the Holy Scriptures. Now let's move on to the second argument. The second argument deals with Daniel chapter 8, verse 23. The little horn was to come at the latter end of the Grecian Empire. After Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, his four generals, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Cassander, divided up the Grecian Empire four ways. This division took place in 301 BC after the Battle of Ipsus. When Seleucus defeated Lysimachus in 281, there were only three Hellenistic kingdoms left. After 200 BC, Rome gradually took control of the Hellenistic kingdoms. In 168 BC, the Macedonian monarchy came to an end, but the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kings stayed in power longer. What is the conclusion of this argument in looking at this history? The Seleucid dynasty existed up to 65 BC. Antiochus Epiphanes ruled the Seleucid power from 175 through 164 BC. Now, did Antiochus come at the end of the Seleucid dynasty? No, not at all. Antiochus came 100 years prior to the end of the Seleucid Empire. Note this clearly. Though Rome became a world power in 168 BC, this prophecy tells us that the little horn would come at the end of all the four horns of Greece. This could have only been Rome, my friends. This little horn power could have only been Rome, because after 65 BC, Roman power enhanced like a freight train speeding ever faster. Now, the third argument deals with Daniel chapter 8, verses 24 and 25. In the context of the parallel prophecy seen in Daniel chapters 2 and 7, we find that the powers of all the beasts from Babylon up to Rome were indeed mighty powers. Every succeeding kingdom grew stronger and crueler than the ones before. From Daniel's point of view, the little horn of Daniel 7 was to be even worse than the fourth beast. Daniel chapter 8 recapitulates on the little horn and brings out more of his attributes. The horn who was to bring dark sentences. Now note, we're talking about Daniel 8 here. The horn who was to bring dark sentences, destroy wonderfully, prosper, destroy God's people, stand up against the Prince of Princes, who is Jesus, is the culmination of the parallel prophecies into a peak insight of this destructive power. And we are told that this power can and will only be destroyed by God himself. Hence, he shall be broken without hand, and that means human hand. Only God can destroy this little horn power, according to this prophecy. So, to apply a prophecy of such magnitude to a man who never resembled such magnitude is an unscrupulous application. Now, the fourth argument deals with Daniel 8:13. What the little horn accomplishes within the 2300-day period is the transgression of desolation. This is what Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24:15. Jesus said the abomination of desolation, according to Daniel the prophet, was future from his day. Now, this little horn power in Daniel 8 cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes, for Jesus placed this event future from his day. Now, on top of this, Daniel 8:17 says, "At the time of the end shall be the vision."
That's an excellent point. The vision of the little horn has everything to do with the abomination of desolation, which Jesus claimed to be future. If Antiochus existed before Jesus, and Jesus made the abomination of desolation future, then the little horn can't apply to Antiochus.
That's right. And here in a moment, we are going to delve into that issue in far more depth. Now let's view the fifth argument. The fifth argument deals with Daniel chapter 8, verse 27. The dispensationalist Charles C. Ryrie declares, dispensationalism is a result of consistent application of the basic hermeneutical principle of literal, normal, or plain interpretation. No other system of theology can claim this, and that comes from Dispensationalism Today, page 96. Dispensationalism, and note this clearly, dispensationalism is only plain and literal where they choose to be. And why is that? The plain, literal, and normal interpretation of the 2300 days of Daniel 8 is that Daniel did not understand the vision until Daniel chapter 9, verses 21 through 24. The vision of the 2300 days, by the plain and literal interpretation, is that it did not begin commencement until the 490 years. It is absolutely impossible to cut off or divide 490 years from 2300 literal days. It's just not possible. Therefore, the 2300 days are years. The statement, this statement right here, consistent literalism is at the heart of dispensational eschatology, is very inconsistent. Furthermore, Antiochus Epiphanes does not fit into a 2300-year period.
I have heard the Antiochus interpretation before. I had problems with it. The problem I personally had are to be found in Daniel 8:23 to 25. Let me sum up my problem in the following way. Daniel 8:23 tells us that the little horn would be a king, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. 8:24 tells us his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty, and also the holy people. 8:25 tells us, through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. According to these verses, the little horn caused deceit to prosper. The papacy has always deceived, just like they did when they changed God's set times and laws. According to these verses, the little horn destroyed God's people. The little horn even rises against the prince of princes. The prince of princes is Jesus Christ. The only man who has fulfilled these points to a great extent is the Catholic Church and the Pope.
I agree. I agree very much so with what you're saying. And what's amazing is that the dispensationalist Clarence Larkin, back in 1929, was smart enough to apply the little horn of Daniel 8 to the Antichrist. Here's what Larkin says. Quite a few Bible scholars claim this little horn is not the same as the little horn that arose amid the 10 horns of the fourth wild beast, but that it represents Antiochus Epiphanes. But the description of this little horn and his conduct does not accord with that of Antiochus Epiphanes, but does with the little horn of the fourth wild beast. Antiochus Epiphanes never cast down any of the host of heaven, or magnified himself against the prince of the host. Neither did he stand up against the prince of princes, Christ, nor was he broken without hand, for he died a natural death at Tebay in BC 165. The angel Gabriel distinctly states that the vision belongs not to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, but to the time of the end. And that comes from Clarence Larkin, his book, The Book of Daniel, pages 140 and 141. And concerning the little horns of both Daniel 7 and 8, Larkin says they both refer to the same person, the Antichrist. Now, Larkin did not apply the little horns to the Pope, but he was more realistic than dispensationalists today. He even admitted, for example, that futurism was developed by the Jesuits.
Wow, it is apparent that the pre-tribulation dispensationalism has progressively grown worse over the last 70 years.
Now, Mike, I want to reiterate on the fourth and fifth arguments above. There are 3 issues that must be studied closely: the daily, the abomination of desolation, and the commencement of the 2300 days. Let us begin with the daily. It should be noted with clarity that the word sacrifice is an addition in Daniel chapter 8, verses 11 through 13. This is also true with Daniel chapter 11:31 and Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. Sacrifice is not in the original, so let us not place it into the texts. Throughout the Old Testament, the word daily in the Hebrew is tamid, and it means continual. This word is used as a precedent or a modifier of other words. For example, Exodus 29:42 says, continual burnt offerings, and that is tamid Allah. Exodus 27:20 says, to burn always, and that is Allah tamid. We find this to be the case throughout the Old Testament, but in Daniel, this is not the case. In every instance in Daniel, daily, the tamid, is not modifying or being modified. Daily, the word daily in Daniel chapter 8, verses 11 through 13, Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, and Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, that word is preceded by the particle article ha. Ha tamid, meaning the daily, is used in every instance. Thus, daily is an outstanding word in the book of Daniel, not a modifier. This is very important to notice. And this is very intriguing because theologically, within the context of the whole book of Daniel, whatever the daily represents in Daniel chapter 8, verses 11 through 13, it is the same in chapters 11:31 and chapter 12, verse 11. This means that the issues in Daniel chapter 11:31 and chapter 12, verse 11 belong to chapter 8, verses 11 through 13. Meaning it's all the same in the book of Daniel. The issues agree with one another. The daily is the same in all these different instances. Okay, let us notice the following observation of scriptures. Let us look at Daniel 8:13, for example. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And of course the answer is in verse 14. And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, apparently in this scripture we see the concept of the daily and the transgression of desolation. Now notice Daniel 11:31. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily, and place there the abomination of desolation. Now notice Daniel 12:11. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now, after looking at these scriptures, note this clearly. Daniel 11:31 and Daniel 12:11 is speaking about the Antichrist. Note this clearly. Taking away the daily is, in essence, what sets up the abomination of desolation. What does this mean? This means that the little horn of Daniel 8 is the Antichrist, because he takes away the daily. Ha tamid, the daily, revolves around the same issues in the book of Daniel. Now this is very significant. Why? Notice the words of Jesus. Matthew 24:15. Jesus says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whosoever reads, let him understand.
Let's stop here for a moment. This is awesome, and let me tell you why. Jesus emphasized that the abomination of desolation was future from his day. Antiochus was alive over 190 years prior to the ministry of Christ. This means that Daniel 8 refers to a time after Christ's day.
That's true.
It's clear that Daniel 8, Daniel 11:31, and Daniel 12:11 are all equally referring to the Antichrist, which Jesus said would be future from his day.
That's all true. And in light of these correlations, how shall we interpret the 2,300 days? Shall we interpret them as 6.5 literal years? For starters, we should learn the relationship between Daniel chapters 8 and 9 to understand this issue. Let's begin with Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 13. Let's talk a little bit about those scriptures. Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 13 give us the picture of a little horn power that would magnify himself to the host of heaven, even as high as the prince of the host. The little horn would take away the daily and cast down the place of the prince's sanctuary along with truth to the ground. In Daniel 8:13, the question is raised, how long will this go on? Daniel 8:14 says, 2,300 evenings and mornings, and the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Note this clearly. In Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 through 15 and verse 17, the Hebrew word that is used for vision is kazon, or kazon. This word is used here to depict the divine oracle or prophecy of Daniel 8 as a whole, with all of its prophetic elements. Interestingly, though, in verses 26 and 27, the Hebrew word that is used for vision, as it applies to the 2300 evenings and mornings, is mare. And this word means phenomenon, spectacle, and appearance. Daniel chapter 8, verses 26 and 27 show that Daniel did not understand the matter of the vision, meaning the mare. In fact, let's look at Daniel 8, verses 26 and 27. Verse 26, and the vision of the evening and mornings which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. Now verse 27, and I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. What he says here is he did not understand the mare, meaning the 2300 years. He didn't understand the phenomena, the spectacle or appearance of that particular part of the prophecy. And let us underscore this for emphasis. In verses 26 and 27, Daniel did not understand the phenomenon of the mare, which is the 2300 evenings and mornings.
DS, is the 2300 day vision answered in Daniel 9?
Yes, it is not until Daniel chapter 9, verses 20 through 24, that we find out, at least in part, what the vision means. Let us look at Daniel chapter 9 and read these verses. Verse 20, now while I was speaking, praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people, Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God. 21. Yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. 22. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. 23. At the beginning of your supplications the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore consider the matter and understand the vision. And then verse 24 says, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. And as you read down into verses 25 and 26, you find out that this 70-week period is subdivided into smaller units. Now, let us note this with clarity. Daniel chapter 9, verse 21 explains that while Daniel was in prayer, Gabriel, who Daniel had seen in the vision, and he's talking about the chazon, meaning the whole prophecy of Daniel 8. Gabriel, who Daniel had seen in that vision, came to speak to him. In Daniel 9:23, Gabriel came to Daniel to give him understanding of the vision. And here the word is mare, and that is the phenomena of the 2300 evenings and mornings. So in essence, Gabriel comes to Daniel to explain to him what this vision represented that he didn't understand in verses 26 and 27. And we must underscore this. It was not until Daniel 9:23 and 24, many years after Daniel 8, that the mare, the 2300 evenings and mornings from chapter 8, 26, and 27 was understood. The interpretation that the 2300 days is connected to the 490 days is not hard to ascertain if one simply reads Daniel's chapter 8 and 9 together. So in light of this, the 2300 days begin commencement with the 70 weeks or 490 years. This can only mean that the 2300 days are years 2, which begin commencement with the 490. And therefore the taking away of the daily, which is the abomination of desolation according to Daniel 11 and Daniel 12, happens sometime in the period of the 2300 years. That is the logical and the natural and literal interpretation.
Okay, DS, now that you've established these key issues, can we go back to the scriptures that deal with the little horn and explain the issues in more detail?
Yes, let us go back to Daniel chapter 8, verses 8 through 10. Verse 8, therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Verse 9, and out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. Now notice the part of verse 9 that says, out of one of them came a little horn. I appeal to chapter 4 of my book to discuss 2 arguments that are often used. One in favor of Rome being the little horn, the other Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, let's look at the first argument in detail. Those who favor that the little horn is Rome tell us the following. Horns in the Hebrew, keren, is feminine. Winds in the Hebrew, ruach, is either masculine or feminine. Them in the Hebrew, hem, is masculine in the third person. Note this clearly. When the great horn was broken off of the goat, out of its place arose 4 horns, meaning feminine, towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them, masculine, came forth a little horn. Now, people who appeal to this argument will tell us that it appears that the little horn did not come out of one of the 4 horns of Greece. And why? Because it does not say that the little horn, feminine, came out of a feminine spot. The little horn, meaning feminine in the Hebrew, did not come out of one of the 4 horns which are in the feminine. Okay? Rather, the little horn came out of one of them, masculine. The little horn came out of one of them, masculine, which most likely refers to the winds, which can be either masculine or feminine. Okay, now, here's the second argument. Those who appeal to Antiochus Epiphanes will tell us that the above correlations of the Hebrew are correct, but let us not leave out the Hebrew for the word one. One, the Hebrew is echad, and it is a feminine adjective singular absolute. In other words, according to those who interpret the little horn as Antiochus Epiphanes will tell us that out of one, feminine, out of one of them came forth a little horn. So the little horn, being feminine, matches the one of them, which is feminine. So the little horn came from one of the 4 horns. So the little horn is Antiochus Epiphanes. That's what they will tell us. Now, in light of what has been analyzed, the little horn cannot be Antiochus. We've proven that quite clearly. But does the second argument pose a problem for those who teach that the little horn is Rome? Not at all. Concerning one, echad, which is feminine, and them, hem, which is masculine, okay? So I need to underscore this. Concerning one and them in relations to winds, I like what the SDA commentary says. They tell us the following. It is doubtful that the writer would assign 2 different genders to the same noun in such close contextual relationship, and that is volume 4, page 84. Now, it is our belief that it would be logical to conclude that the little horn came from both the 4 winds and out of one of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The way that Daniel chapter 8 verses 8 and 9 is grammatically set up could infer that Rome came out of the 4 winds and that Rome has its own origin, but Rome implemented much of the Grecian society into itself. In this respect, we can say that Rome has an indirect origin from Greece. Now, the following historical sources best describe this situation. We read in the following. From the opening of the historic period, the development of Roman civilization was profoundly affected by foreign influences, in particular by Etruscan and Greek. But whereas the influence of the Etruscans virtually ceased with the expulsion of their kings from Rome, that of the Greeks continued with increasing strength throughout the whole of the period of the Republic. It was inevitable that older and more advanced Hellenic civilization should leave an indelible imprint upon the younger and less highly developed culture of Rome. And in fact, there is hardly a single important aspect of Roman civilization that does not reveal unmistakable traces of imitating or borrowing ideas that originated among the Greeks. With obvious truth, the Roman poet Horace could say, "Captive Greece has captured her rude conqueror," and this comes from The Growth of European Civilization, Volume 1, page 84. Now here is another quote from this same source, Volume 1, page 93. Contact with the Greeks led to the introduction of Greek divinities, and of much greater importance to the identification of the native Italian gods with those of the Greek pantheon, with the result that Greek mythology and forms of artistic representation were taken over wholesale by the Romans. That is an excellent quote. The two arguments that are normally used in defense for or against Antiochus both have their omissions. This need not be the case. Rome came out of its own settings, the four winds, and borrowed much of its civilization from the Greeks, the four horns.
That's a good analysis, the best that I've seen on this issue. Usually theologians argue until they're blue in the face on those Hebrew words, and yet you've dismantled the need for all that debate.
Yeah, it's not really that difficult, especially with all the other exterior issues that have been discussed up to this point.
All right, before you continue, I'd also like to ask an important question.
Yes.
When you say that the little horn is Rome, do you mean pagan Rome or papal Rome?
I mean both. I believe that pagan Rome is included in this prophecy as the predecessor of the papacy, but ultimately I believe that this prophecy is fixated mainly on the papacy. I will prove my point as we continue with these verses. Verse 10, "And it, the little horn, grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them." I have heard some interpreters argue that stars represent angels, as in Job 38:7, and that to cast down the host of heaven and some of the stars refer to the papal system of worship disrupting the ministry of angels, as is described in Hebrews 1:14. Why is this? Because Hebrews 1:14 describes the angels as ministering spirits sent forth to minister unto them who shall be heirs of salvation. This is a possible interpretation, but there is another. Stars also represent God's people. For example, Daniel 12:3 says, "Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." And also notice what Daniel 8:24 says about the little horn. "His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people." I would argue that the little horn casting down the host of heaven and of the stars, trampling upon them, represents the little horn casting down God's people. Notice Hebrews 12:22 through 24. "But you," and this is verse 22, "but you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels." 23, "to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect." 24, "to Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel." Notice that the church is registered in heaven. The church is registered in heaven because Jesus is high priest for the church, as the book of Hebrews explains. So, by the papacy trampling on God's people during the 1260 years, they cast down the host and stars. And the other interpretation, which concerns the ministry of angels being cast down, can also be included in this interpretation as well. I think both fit quite well.
Those are some very interesting connections. They make sense.
Yes, they do. Now let us look at Daniel chapter 8, verse 11. "He, that is the little horn, even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down." Let us raise the question, who is the prince of the host? Daniel chapter 8, verse 25 calls him the princes of princes. Note this clearly. The little horn exalted himself as high as Jesus Christ. Haven't we already seen this in the last study on the little horn of Daniel chapter 7? According to Lucius Ferrarus, Prompta Bibliotheca, Article 2, Volume 5, the 1858 edition, columns 1823 through 1824, we see how the popes have fulfilled this prophecy of magnifying themselves as high as Jesus Christ. Notice point number 1 of Article 2. The Pope is of so great dignity and so exalted that he is not mere man, but as it were God and the vicar of God. Point number 13. Hence the Pope is crowned with a triple crown as King of heaven and of earth and of hell. Point number 16. For he is of so great dignity and power that he forms one and the same tribunal with Christ.
One and the same tribunal.
Now, we don't need to go beyond these 3 points because we covered enough of them in the study of the little horn of Daniel chapter 7.
This Pope, he has an ego. Could you be any more egotistic than that? He's one in the same tribunal with God.
Isn't that ridiculous?
Pretty much. All right, DS, if he's the same as God or Jesus Christ, the vicar of Christ, Christ replacement, all that idiotic talk.
Yep.
If he is all that, DS, why does he have to have security and armed bodyguards when he walks around?
That's true.
Why doesn't he perform miracles like Jesus did? Or like Peter? Certainly, if he were Peter's successor, which they claim they are, he would be able to do that, right?
Well said, Mike.
He'd be able to do that much. Every time that I hear these quotes, I get really, really annoyed. Because no man is equal with God.
Yes, that's true. Now let's go back to Daniel chapter 8, verse 11. Verse 11 reads, He, that is the little horn, even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. According to this verse, the exaltation of the little horn, making himself as high as the prince, meaning Jesus, was not the only problem. The daily of the prince was taken away, and the place of the prince's sanctuary was cast down. Now, let us raise the question. What is the sanctuary of Jesus? Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 and 2 tells us the answer. Verse 1 says, Now this is the main point of the things we are saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. 2, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle which the Lord erected and not man. Note this clearly. Jesus Christ is the high priest in the true tabernacle which the Lord erected, and not man, and this sanctuary is in heaven. Now, what is the daily? Hebrews chapter 7, verses 24 through 26 gives us that answer. Verse 24 says, But he, meaning Jesus, because he continues forever. Hold on, wait a minute, let's stop here for a minute. Notice this. He, that is Jesus, because he continues forever. There is the daily. The tamid, which means the continual, is present right here in this verse. Jesus Christ continues forever. That is the tamid. That is the daily. Now, let us start over and read through. But he, because he continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. 25. Therefore he is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. 26. For such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens. Now, how did the papacy take away the daily? And how did the papacy cast down the sanctuary? Here is the answer. The papacy substituted a pagan priesthood in the place of Christ's ministry. Note this clearly. Pagan Rome, and we're going back to pagan Rome for a moment. Pagan Rome borrowed much of its religion and priesthood from Babylon. We learn in the following source. The solar theology of the Chaldeans had a decisive effect upon the final form reached by the religion of the pagan Semites, and following them by that of the Romans when Aurelian, the conqueror of Palmyra, had raised Sol Invictus, meaning the invincible sun, to the rank of supreme divinity in the empire. And that comes from the Cambridge Ancient History, Volume 11, pages 646 and 647. Now, Papal Rome borrowed much of its religion and priesthood from pagan Rome. And the following source we read, in order to recommend the new religion, meaning Christianity, to the heathen, The use of temples, and these dedicated to particular saints, and ornamented on occasions with branches of trees, incense, lamps, and candles, votive offerings on recovery from illness, holy water, asylums, holidays and seasons, use of calendars, processions, blessings of the fields, sacerdotal vestments, the tonsure, the ring in marriage, turning to the east, images at a later date, perhaps the ecclesiastical chant, and the Kyrie eleison were introduced, he says. Or it's actually, let me repeat this word. It is the Kyrie eleison, okay, were introduced. And this comes from J.H. Newman, an essay on the development of Christian doctrine, page 373.
Yeah. I see now even more clearly where we're heading, DS. The pagan priesthood of the papacy was made to substitute the Melchizedek priesthood in Hebrews.
Yes, you hit the hammer on the nail. Now let's move into this issue by starting with the next two verses. Daniel chapter 8 verses 12 and 13 say, "Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, How long will the vision be concerning the daily, and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" We can sum up these two verses with a few paragraphs from chapter 4. The Melchizedek priesthood, as is described in Hebrews, is the central point of the vision of Daniel 8. The daily of Jesus Christ. The daily of Jesus is his intercessory work on behalf of all those who accept him as Savior and Lord. The daily of Jesus Christ is the middle point between the heavenly and the earthly sanctuary. Let's stop here for a moment and think. As you recall, in the study of futurism, we demonstrated how the church is the temple of God through the humanity of Christ. Therefore, the sanctuary in heaven and the sanctuary on earth, meaning the church, is brought together through Christ's humanity. The two sanctuaries are in two locations, but they are one in Christ. Therefore, when the papacy substituted its pagan priesthood in Christendom, this was the abomination of desolation. For this abomination, forced on Christianity, obscured the relationship between heaven and earth. This is exactly why Revelation 13:6 states that the beast opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. This text right here in Revelation 13:6 shows that the tabernacle being blasphemed is in heaven. In other words, what happens to the sanctuary on earth, the church, affects the sanctuary in heaven.
This is all so clear. Now I see why the Jesuit idea of a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem is a doctrine of deception. And why is this? That doctrine takes the eyes of the Christian world off of the abomination of desolation that actually took place with the papacy. Moreover, futurism actually blinds the minds of the Christian world to the truth of Christ's sanctuary and his priestly ministry. DSI would go so far as to say that dispensationalism, like the papacy, is fulfilling the abomination of desolation.
Mike, I am amazed at how well you pick up things, man. It's amazing. We have not got to that study yet, and yet you already see that issue with clarity.
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to get the listeners to understand that they're being deceived.
Now let's clarify more how the papacy has obscured the Melchizedek priesthood of Christ. Note this clearly. The priesthood of the papacy attempted to replace the Melchizedek priesthood of Jesus Christ. Here are some examples. The Pope claims to be head over the church. Notice the following document. The Pope, Bishop of Rome and Peter's successor, is the perpetual and visible source and foundation of the unity of both of the bishops and of the whole company of the faithful. For the Roman pontiff, by reason of his office as vicar of Christ and as pastor of the entire church, has full, supreme, and universal power over the whole church, a power which he can always exercise unhindered. And that comes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, a sure norm for teaching the faith, page 254, paragraph 882. I think that document was plain. Now, what does the papacy say about its priesthood? Notice the following documentation. Everything that the priesthood of the Old Covenant prefigured finds its fulfillment in Jesus Christ, the one mediator between God and men. The Christian tradition considers Melchizedek, priest of God Most High, as a prefiguration of the priesthood of Christ, the unique high priest after the order of Melchizedek. It is the same priest, Christ Jesus, whose sacred person his minister truly represents. Now the minister, by reason of the sacerdotal consecration which he has received, is truly made like to the high priest and possesses the authority to act in the power and place of the person of Christ himself. Now, are you seeing this?
Yeah.
Christ is the source of all priesthood. The priest of the old law was a figure of Christ, and the priest of the new law acts in the person of Christ. And this comes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, a sure norm for teaching the faith, pages 429 and 430, paragraph 1544 and 1548. Now, if you just noticed this a moment ago, everything they said in the very first paragraph looked good, that Jesus Christ is the high priest after the order of Melchizedek. But as you continue reading on, they demonstrate how the priests of Rome act in the place of Christ inside of this priesthood. These statements mean, and note this clearly, these statements in the Catechism mean that the priesthood of Catholicism is made to be the Melchizedek priesthood, and the Pope himself acts in the place of Christ as priest after the order of Melchizedek. These assertions of the papacy are impossible, my friends, impossible. For Hebrews 7:24 says that the Melchizedek priesthood is unchangeable. The Greek for this word is aparabatus, meaning unchangeable and therefore not liable to pass to a successor. Nobody can act in the Melchizedek priesthood. The Melchizedek priesthood cannot pass on to anybody else other than Jesus. So what the Catholic Church has just told us is that they are antichrist because they are trying to act in place of Christ in his priesthood. They are the power that fulfilled the prophecy of the little horn in Daniel 8. It is unequivocal. That is the way things really are.
Is there ever an end to these problems? The Church of Rome has eclipsed the Melchizedek priesthood of Christ for centuries, especially during the Dark Ages. You would think that people could identify the Catholic Church because God has allowed that power to do what it does for centuries and centuries. Centuries and centuries of this repetition is not hard to see. No wonder the Lord must return, because if he didn't, this crap would go on for several more centuries and people would just sit prostrate like automatons. DS, we're just about out of time for this week, but man, you've done it again. You've managed to get me all riled up about all the ridiculousness and retardation that they've pulled on the people. And of course, I mean the Catholic Church and that man of lawlessness, the Pope.
Very true, Mike. Very true. I must say to the audience that this issue will be continued next week. Next week, we are going to spend some time in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, and we will recapitulate Daniel 8 with the issues of Daniel 9. My goal, if time permits, is also to line up the additional identifying marks of Daniel 8 with those of Daniel 7 so that the audience can clearly see the attributes of the papal Antichrist. So until next week, Mike and audience, God bless, and I hope your week goes well.
Sounds like something not to miss. Next week on Hearing the Truth, Little Horn of Daniel 8, Part 2. Join us, won't you? This is the message that God wants you to hear, and we're getting to the meat of it. Nowhere else on the planet will you hear this. You know why? Because people are afraid to broadcast the truth. They're afraid they'll turn people away and they'll lose money if they air this stuff. Because we all live in the devil's world. The whole world is managed by Satan. We are his employees. And what happens to employees who promote the competition? They're fired, cut off, railroaded. In other words, not allowed to buy or sell